I want to welcome you all to Acquiring Aquinas, where we look at each of the articles of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, break it down into their essential parts so that we can really get a better understanding of what Aquinas is arguing for, what he's arguing against, and it really will give us a sense of the system of doctrine or particular beliefs that Aquinas holds as a whole. To give us a sense of what's happening in this article, we can look at the topic, inquiry, and answer for this article. So the general question that he's looking at in question 1 is the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. So he's really talking about the subject matter of the sacred doctrine itself. The article is asking the question whether sacred doctrine is a science, and in his definitive answer to this is that sacred doctrine is a science, and this is what he will argue for in this article. First, we'll look at his particular objections that he identifies against the main answer that he provides. The first objection argument is as follows. All sciences proceed from self-evident principles. Sacred doctrine does not proceed from self-evident principles. Thus, sacred doctrine is not a science, and this contradicts the answer. The major premise that all sciences proceed from self-evident principles is really taken from Aristotle's notion of science, which really deals with what are called strict demonstrations, or syllogisms that have as their ultimate premises self-evident principles. Aristotle gives us a set of qualities that these self-evident propositions have in his posterior analytics 1. He says they must be true, primary, immediate, or without a middle, better known or more familiar than the conclusion, prior to the conclusion, and causing the conclusion. So if the ultimate premises of an argument don't have all of these features in common, then they won't be part of a scientific set of doctrines. The minor premise for this objection is that sacred doctrine does not proceed from self-evident principles. As opposed to self-evident principles, it's argued, sacred doctrine proceeds from articles of faith, which are not self-evident, since their truth is not admitted by all. As 2 Thessalonians 3:2 says, for all men have not faith. And from these two premises, the conclusion follows that sacred doctrine is thus not a science. The second objection argument reads, the major premise, no science principally deals with individual facts. The minor premise, sacred doctrine principally deals with individual facts. Conclusion, thus sacred doctrine is not a science. And this also contradicts the answer that sacred doctrine is a science. Support for the major premise also comes from Aristotle, who argues that science deals with universals as opposed to individuals or individual facts. For example, in the Poetics, Aristotle downgrades the importance of a study such as history due to the fact that it is specifically concerned with singulars and not universals. So it looks at individual and contingent events by individual contingent people. Science, on the other hand, is envisioned to deal exclusively with the essential or timeless truths and not with these contingent ones. The minor premise, sacred doctrine principally deals with individual facts. Aquinas points merely to the content in sacred scripture, which deals with the deeds of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So given this minor premise and the major, it follows that thus sacred doctrine is not a science. Okay, let's look at the orienting argument, or the on the contrary argument. The major premise is that which deals with saving faith is a science. Sacred doctrine is that which deals with saving faith. Thus, sacred doctrine is a science. The support for this premise, I think, includes something implicit, but it may be at least partially be referring back to Aquinas' best answer for Article 1, Question 1, in which he is arguing that some things known are known by divine revelation. There he argues that some ends of human beings are known by divine revelation, and his suggestion here is that Augustine is referring to this knowledge as a kind of science of saving faith, namely knowledge concerning human salvation. In other words, that there is some science of the ends of human beings. Aquinas points to St. Augustine for further support when he says, in referring to the De Trinitate, quote, to this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened, end quote. Here St. Augustine is specifically connecting saving faith not only as a science in name, but also as that wherein saving faith is protected or defended, as well as strengthened or given the kind of foundation that is suitable for a science. Now, in terms of the minor premise, Aquinas merely points out here, with respect to the idea that sacred doctrine is that which deals with saving faith, that Augustine surely here must be referring to sacred doctrine, since this can be said of no science except sacred doctrine. Now we move on to Aquinas' best argument for the answer. The major premise: all doctrine that proceeds by the light of a higher science is a science. Minor premise: sacred doctrine is a doctrine that proceeds by the light of a higher science. Thus, sacred doctrine is a science. Now he reminds us once again of Aristotle's particular way of dealing with and approaching science. And he says we must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence, such as arithmetic and geometry and the like. For example, the notion of a geometrical point or a number, the number 1, will proceed from a principle known by the natural light of reason. He continues, and this is the support for the major premise: there are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry, and music from principles established by arithmetic. Of course, what he means by the science of perspective has to do with painting, in which you have ideas functioning within the painting, such as the vanishing point. Similarly, with music, there are mathematical principles related to the harmony of various tones that can be expressed through arithmetic. Now, in terms of the minor premise that sacred doctrine is a doctrine that proceeds by the light of a higher science, Aquinas says that it is sacred doctrine that is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed. Hence, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught him by the mathematician, so sacred science is established on principles revealed by God. So certainly the source of this higher science for sacred doctrine is very unique from the other sciences. It does fit the category of coming from a higher and secure source, namely God's knowledge of himself, that is communicated to human beings and believed on faith. And so that, according to Aquinas, this meets the criteria of that which is known by the light of a higher science. We conclude here with counters to the objection arguments. So this is where Aquinas targets specific premises in the objection arguments to show which one of these is false. Since the arguments given are valid, the only way that the conclusion can be rejected by Aquinas is to show that one or more of the premises are false. So the premise he has a problem with in the first objection argument is the one that all sciences proceed from self-evident principles. Here he very clearly argues that not all sciences proceed from self-evident principles themselves, but that some of them derive their principles from a higher science, and this is what is argued for in sacred doctrine. And so Aquinas holds the contradictory of this major premise, which is some sciences do not proceed from self-evident principles. Now, in terms of the second objection argument, he targets the minor premise, which is sacred doctrine principally deals with individual facts. He rejects this in favor of the idea that sacred doctrine does not principally deal with individual facts. Aquinas says that individual facts are treated of in sacred doctrine not because it is concerned with them principally, but they are introduced rather as examples to be followed in our lives, such as in instructing us in moral science, and in order to establish the authority of those through whom the divine revelation on which the sacred scripture or doctrine is based has come down to us. So he's rejecting the notion that sacred doctrine is primarily about individual facts, in favor of the idea that these individual facts are secondary to the more universal truths that are given to us through the moral principles, moral teachings that are universal in nature, as given through the moral examples, as well as identifying authority for accepting the truth of those that confess universal truths given in Scripture. For example, the life of St. Paul to establish the testimony to his more universal teachings that were foundational for the Christian faith.